before talking about any of the policies and positions that I hold and would support, we need to explore the purpose of government, and before that, we need to understand the underlying principles that undergird conservatism and conservative thought. We need to go back to figure out what is truth, where does it come from, what is righteousness, and what is morality. Okay? So there are a few different philosophies, philosophy being the idea of trying to find truth. Okay? So we have the empiricist. The empiricist believes everything based on empirical data, what they can see, taste, feel, smell, and hear. Okay? If they cannot experience it, to them, it's not real. Only what they've experienced is real. Then you have the rationalist. The rationalist questions everything. He uses deductive reasoning to question and question and question until he gets to the most atomized point of a question, to where he feels that he cannot question any further or what makes sense. And this is how the rationalist tries to get to truth. So based on these two ideas, we come up with a famous question. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, years before that question came up, St. Augustine had already answered it. He said, in essence, that I have faith so that I can understand. So he has faith that God's laws are universal, binding over all the globe, and whether he experiences it or not, the law still applies. This law is known as the law of nature. Okay? So all of the philosophies come with base assumptions. The empiricist has the base assumption that his senses can be trusted. The rationalist has the base assumption that he can get to truth if he continues to question. Our base assumption is that there is a God who created the world, established universal law, the law of nature, established moral law, and ultimately that God is found in the Bible because conservatism comes from Judeo-Christianity. Okay? Many of the problems that we have today in our society come from a direct rejection of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible. In Genesis 1:1, we have it mentioned 10 times that each species will produce after their own kind. Well, it seems pretty clear that that contradicts evolution. But it's in direct line with everything that we see. We see that apple seeds produce apple trees, which produce apple seeds. Humans give off human offspring. Dogs, cats, you name it. They all produce after their own kind and do not transform or produce anything that is of an evolved form of a different kind. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is that God created man and woman. Okay? So we get into the rejection of man and woman, that these are just human concepts, that we can choose what gender we want. Really, gender is a made-up word anyway. It's sex. Choose which sex we want. But that's not true. Okay? And then we come up to yet another piece, that the first commandment given to Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth. Okay? To subdue the earth and have dominion over it. All right? Being fruitful and multiplying is the first commandment. When we take sex away from its original intention, which is to produce offspring, we end up rationalizing it to being any sort of sexual pleasure whatsoever. So you start with the use of contraceptives for the purpose of seeking pleasure while taking away the original intent of sex. You get into the concept of homosexuality, which has now become, unfortunately, seemingly more and more mainstream, especially since the court's ruling. And you get into the ultimately justification of the murder of children for the purpose of seeking pleasure, sacrificing to the God of sexual pleasure instead of worshiping the one true God. So a lot of concepts are covered right there in the very first book of the very first chapter in the Bible. Okay, and once we reject that God is a creator, that God established laws, that he made man and woman, that he produced everything to reproduce after their own kind, and that the purpose of sex is to reproduce after our own kind and to be fruitful and multiply. We get away from these concepts and we can get into some really wonky territory. So that's where I'm going to end this video.